Okay, I think we should get started. I'm delighted to be here chairing this session. I'm especially delighted to be here participating in this conference honoring Jeff's extraordinary contributions to philosophy. Like virtually everyone else in this room, I have been the incredibly lucky recipient of Jeff's absolutely extraordinary generosity. Jeff has helped me so much, there's just no way to describe how much he's helped me. The course of my life has been, dramatically altered by Jeff's help, and it's been made much better, I'm very sure. One of the extraordinary things that Jeff has done is nurture a community of outstanding philosophers who work in just war theory, and it has been one of the truly great joys of my life to be a kind of honorary member of that community, even though I don't really work in just war, but they've let me join their discussions. So I'm so happy to be here celebrating Jeff. And I'm also delighted to be here to introduce one of those outstanding members of the Just War community, Helen. And Helen is going to be talking to us about some puzzles to do with proportionality.
Thanks very much, John. Thanks very much to Elad for organizing what's been a really terrific conference, a huge amount of work, and an enormous success. So thank you so much, and thank you for inviting me. It's such a pleasure to be here to celebrate Jeff's career and retirement. So I first really got to know Jeff. I've realized this is a thing you have to do at the start of your talk now, where you explain how you got to know Jeff. So I first got to know Jeff when I was a graduate student. So one of my supervisors, Andrew Williams, who I hope it's still here, was supposed to be going off to Princeton for a year. And it was thought a good idea if I went with him. And then for some reason, I can't remember, that fell through. And so my other supervisor, Brad Hooker, as a sort of consolation prize, suggested I go and work with his old friend, Jeff McMahan at Rutgers. So you were actually kind of second best, Jeff, I'm sorry. But as consolation prizes go, it worked out pretty well. And Jeff has been a wonderful source of advice and support and encouragement for the whole of my career since then. And of course, we're always very grateful as academics when people give us that kind of help. But it's always especially precious coming from Jeff, I think, because a lot of people, many of you won't know this because Jeff doesn't like to talk about it, but he's actually really busy. And so, thank you, Jeff, for nevertheless always finding the time in that schedule and never once mentioning what an inconvenience it is. I know I speak for all of us when I say. Anyway, so yes. Now, the more attentive amongst you will have noticed that there's a typo in the schedule, which is entirely my fault, it's not Elad's fault. It says that the title, in the schedule it says the title is Two Puzzles About Proportionate Defense. But I didn't ask Elad to correct it because I realized that the main claim of the paper is basically that the typo doesn't matter. Right, so a puzzle about deterrence is a puzzle about defense. And so it would have been kind of self-undermining if I'd made a big fuss about how we needed to correct it. And so deterrence, I think, has been a bit neglected by theorists of defensive harm. It's attracted much more attention from people interested in punishment. But deterrence, of course, aims at preventing harm, like we were talking about in Tom's talk this morning, and so it is a form of defense. And so I think those of us who are interested in permissible defense should probably pay it a bit more attention. Now, in this talk, I defend the claim that deterrence is subject to the same proportionality constraints as other defensive measures, and I'll call this claim parity, which we can state a little bit more formally as follows. So other things being equal, the degree of harm that it's proportionate to impose or risk imposing in the course of preventing a harm H is invariant between deterrence and other forms of defense. So this paper addresses two puzzles about the proportionality of deterrence, each of which seems to pose a problem for parity. So this is part of a new sort of broader project of mine on the ethics of deterrence. Very much still a work in progress, which will be very obvious. But I thought it'd be a kind of a nice sort of contained thing to think about for the purposes of this conference. So according to the exploitation puzzle, which is originally posed by Larry Alexander, there are no proportionality constraints on the measures that one may use to deter culpable wrongdoers. Now, if this were true, then if parity were also true, this would entail that there are no proportionality constraints on measures that one may use to defend against culpable wrongdoers in general, provided, of course, that they're forewarned of the defense. According to the collateral puzzle, if deterrence is subject to the same proportionality constraints as defense, then many seemingly permitted deterrent mechanisms must in fact be prohibited in light of their collateral harms. So what I want to argue here is that we can resolve both of these puzzles in ways that leave parity intact. All right, so we'll start with the exploitation puzzle. So consider a case that I'll call exploit. So Jeff wants to steal Victor's watch. Victor throws the watch into his yard with the dogs. Victor warns Jeff that the dogs will attack him if he tries to steal the watch. Victor seems permitted to throw his watch into the yard. Doing so looks equivalent to a host of other intuitively permissible things that Victor might do to try to stop Jeff from stealing his watch, such as placing it somewhere high in order to make it dangerous for Jeff to reach it. Yet Victor's protective measure means that if Jeff tries to steal the watch, then he'll likely suffer a cost that far exceeds that which Victor would be permitted to directly impose on Jeff in defense of his watch. So Larry Alexander and more recently David Arm argue that if Victor's protective action was subject to a proportionality constraint, then it would surely fall foul of it. Hence, Victor's action must not be subject to such a constraint. They argue that because Jeff is forewarned of the risk that he'll be running, it's Jeff and not Victor who's responsible for any harm that Jeff suffers. Since Victor isn't responsible for Jeff suffering the harm, it doesn't make any sense to ask whether it's proportionate for Victor to impose it. We can thus vindicate the intuitive permissibility of Victor's protective action in exploit. Now take a case that we'll call create. So Jeff still wants to steal Victor's watch, which is in Victor's yard. Victor lets his dogs into the yard, and he warns Jeff that the dogs will attack him. Oh no, hold on. If he tries to steal the watch. Now the puzzle arises because it seems unlikely that moving the dogs to the watch rather than the watch to the dogs could be a morally significant difference between create and exploit, at least if we assume that the only purpose of releasing the dogs in create is to protect the watch. So in each case, Victor uses the dogs in order to make it harder for Jeff to steal his watch. So if Victor may exploit an existing danger, presence of the dogs, in order to protect his watch, then he may surely create the same danger, make the dogs present, to that same end. If so, then it seems that Victor must also act permissibly in create. And this means that defensive actions that create dangers must also be exempt from proportionality constraints, provided that the offenders are forewarned of these dangers. This implies that Victor also acts permissibly in defend. So Jeff still wants to steal Victor's watch, which is already in the yard. Victor warns Jeff that if Jeff should try to steal his watch, then he will release the hounds. Jeff climbs over the fence into the yard. Victor lets the dogs into the yard to try and prevent Jeff from stealing the watch, and then Jeff gets mauled and they bite off his foot. Now, most people will probably believe that Victor acts wrongly in defend. Is it too late for a trigger warning? I don't know. But here too, Victor uses his dogs to create a danger that makes it harder for Jeff to steal his watch, and Jeff is forewarned of the risks of attempting the theft. So if we can see that Victor's actions in exploit, create, and defend are in fact on a moral par, then we seem to have abandoned the proportionality constraint on defense against culpable wrongdoers who've been warned of the kind of defense that they will encounter. Now, these three cases are all instances of what's normally called special deterrence. So they each involve trying to prevent Jeff specifically from committing a particular wrong. And so we can contrast this with general deterrence, where we might harm Jeff as a means of preventing other people from committing wrongs. So I'm not going to say anything about general deterrence here, nor about kind of shoring up the general efficacy of issuing deterrent threats. So let's just suppose that no one will ever find out what goes on between Jeff and Victor and the dogs, in order to focus our minds on the particular problem posed by the exploitation puzzle. Now, I think a natural response to this puzzle might point to the fact that Victor acts last in defend, whereas Jeff acts last in the create and exploit cases. So if this matters, then we could permit Victor's action in the exploit and create cases, where Jeff acts last, but prohibit his action in defend. Now, David Arm rejects this response, arguing that it's unclear why the permissibility of Victor's protective measure should depend on who happens to act last. If there's no proportionality constraint on what Victor does in create, he says, it must be because we hold Jeff responsible for the harm that he suffered. He knew what he was doing, and he has to take his chances. Yet this is no less true in defend. So if this is what makes Jeff responsible for the harm that he suffers, that he knew what he was doing and he needs to take his chances, then why would it do so only on the condition that he also acts last? So Arm thinks that we would do better to show that only exploiting dangers is exempt from proportionality and not creating dangers. And then we could permit Victor's action in exploit, but prohibit his actions in both create and defend. Now, I think that to the contrary, exploit and create stand or fall together in terms of their permissibility, and that, like the defend case, both are subject to a proportionality constraint. We can nonetheless permit Victor's actions in exploit and create and prohibit his action in defend without undermining parity. Arm and Alexander each neglect the moral value of deterrence, that is, the fact that deterrence increases the chance that nobody will suffer any harm, and hence they neglect the role that this value plays in proportionality calculations. So as we've just seen, they take the moral significance of offenders being forewarned to be that this makes the offenders responsible for any harm that they suffer. But the moral significance of forewarning is that it makes deterrence possible. And we have to include the value of this, of increasing the chance that Victor gets to keep his watch without needing to harm Jeff, when we assess the proportionality of Victor's protective action. This value can make it proportionate to threaten and risk the imposition of a harm that it would be disproportionate to intentionally impose. So in both exploit and create, Jeff is going to be harmed as an unintended side effect of an action that's aimed at protecting Victor's watch, where, crucially, that action can secure a good that cannot be secured in the defend case. Now, Daniel Farrell has made a kind of similar point about how deterrence can harmlessly increase the chance that nobody suffers a harm. But he doesn't connect this to the exploitation puzzle. In fact, I think Farrell seems to kind of miss the force of this puzzle, even though he explicitly recognizes what he calls the all-important question of the limits on what one may threaten as a means of deterrence. So Farrell argues that we may make deterrent threats and then enforce them only if our threats fall within these limits, which, although they're unspecified, somewhat exceed what would be proportionate to the prevention of the threatened wrong. So, for example, he says it might be permissible to threaten to imprison someone for 2 years, even if preventing their offense would justify only 6 months in prison. And then if the person fails to be deterred by the threat, then one may enforce the threat as part of a broader strategy of general deterrence. Yet the challenge of the exploitation puzzle is that we seem to be permitted to use deterrent mechanisms that risk imposing costs that dramatically outstrip both what we may do to prevent the wrong and what someone could plausibly be liable to as a means of promoting general deterrence. So Victor seems permitted to use the dogs to guard his watch, risking that Jeff's going to suffer this serious mauling, even though a serious mauling just wildly exceeds what Victor may intentionally do to Jeff to protect his My Little Pony watch. Farrell's focus on the permissibility of the subsequent intentional imposition of the threatened harm, the kind of classic punishment question, like why can we still do it later once the threat's been averted, I think causes him to overlook the question of the permissibility of using deterrent mechanisms that risk imposing harm as a side effect. And it's these kinds of cases that generate the exploitation puzzle. Now, although my proposed explanation of the permissibility of using the dogs in exploit and create appeals to the value of deterrence, it isn't a special consideration that applies only to deterrent actions, thereby distinguishing deterrence from defense in a way that threatens parity, or maybe suggests that other things never are equal in the way that parity requires. The good that we can secure via deterrence, namely the possibility that nobody suffers any harm, or perhaps much less harm than they otherwise would, also arises with respect to some non-deterrent defensive actions. So take a case that we can call portcullis. So here, Victor, I didn't do the gruesome bit here. Victor can lower a portcullis that will stop Jeff from getting into the yard, but there's a chance that it will kind of malfunction and Jeff's foot will get trapped under the portcullis, severing it. Now, lowering the portcullis isn't a deterrent measure, but like deterrence, it can harmlessly bring it about that Victor isn't wronged. And like deterrence, it carries with it the risk that Jeff will be harmed as an unintended side effect. We might also helpfully think about cases in which a deterrent action collaterally harms a wrongdoer, but not because they're undeterred. So take a case we can call gun. Victor brandishes a gun in a bid to deter Jeff from stealing his watch, knowing that there's a chance that the gun will go off by accident and cause the loss of Jeff's foot. Jeff's unlucky and is shot before he has a chance to desist. I think we should judge the permissibility of brandishing the gun just as we judge portcullis, which is also how we should judge exploit and create. So suppose that in each case there's an equal chance of preventing Jeff from committing the wrong, either because he's impeded or deterred, and an equal chance of Jeff losing his foot as an unintended side effect. Holding these things constant, I think that Victor either acts permissibly or impermissibly in all four cases. The fact that Jeff is harmed because he fails to be deterred and exploit and create doesn't seem to be a reason to treat these cases differently, permitting Victor to act in these cases but not in portcullis and gun. Jeff's just as responsible for Victor's using the portcullis and brandishing the gun as he is for Victor's using the dogs. What matters in each case is simply how much of a chance of imposing a disproportionate harm it's proportionate to take in a bid to avoid anyone suffering any harm in the prevention of a wrong. So if Victor's permitted to take a certain chance that lowering the portcullis will cause the loss of Jeff's foot, then he's permitted to take the same chance that brandishing the gun and using his dogs will do so. Indeed, Victor might be required to use potentially harmless defense, including deterrence, rather than intentionally use force. So if Victor can stop Jeff from stealing his watch, say by either punching Jeff in the face in direct defense or by using his dogs as a deterrent, then the necessity constraint requires Victor to use the dogs if there's a good enough chance that Jeff will be deterred. Now, we might object that deterrent measures of the sort that Victor uses in exploit and create rely on the threatened harm in a way that precludes characterizing that harm as incidental. But I don't think that they do. So if Victor intends to deter Jeff, then he's not relying on the harm that arises if his deterrence fails, if this means that it features in his practical reasoning about what he ought to do. After all, a convincing bluff would do just as well in terms of deterrence, and Victor ought to convincingly bluff if he can, but it's only if he doesn't have a convincing bluff available that he's permitted to risk harming Jeff. So if, say, Victor could convince Jeff that there are dogs in the yard just by playing a soundtrack of barking, for example, or perhaps imitating the dogs himself, then he ought not to use the actual dogs in order to protect his watch. That the use of deterrent measures is constrained by necessity further supports the view that they're constrained. The use of deterrent measures is constrained by necessity further supports the view that they're constrained by proportionality. Our reasons to avoid unnecessarily harming even culpable wrongdoers also seem likely to support avoiding imposing unwarranted harm. So the lack of this deterrent value explains why Victor may not release the hounds and defend. There's no prospect of deterring Jeff at this point, and so there's no chance of avoiding the harm altogether that can weigh against the risk of Jeff's being mauled. It's also why Victor acts wrongly in exploit and create if he knows that Jeff will not be deterred. So if Victor knows that like Jeff's coming for the My Little Pony watch, even if it literally costs him an arm and a leg, then Victor may not use the dogs to protect the watch. This is also why, if he sees Jeff climbing over the fence in exploit or create, and he realizes that his attempts at deterrence have failed, then Victor needs to call off the dogs. After all, what could justify a failure to do this? At this point, Victor's just faced with a man, pensioner, about to be mauled by dogs. Victor would have a duty to save Jeff from being mauled by dogs at the cost of losing his watch, even if Jeff had imperiled himself through some wrongdoing. Avoiding the loss of his watch, therefore, cannot justify failing to save Jeff. And if Victor has a duty to save Jeff from being mauled by dogs as they try to defend his watch, then he surely has a duty not to use the dogs in exploit and create if he knows that Jeff cannot be deterred, just as he may not use them in defense. So the permissibility of Victor's defensive action in exploit and create, crucially depends then on its having some prospect of a deterrent effect. So this is why the warning matters. Any mauling is just a regrettable side effect of the failure of the deterrent mechanism, and the risk of Jeff suffering it must be justified by the expected value of the deterrent mechanism, where this can be sensitive as well to the fact that Jeff's better off if Victor manages to deter him, and so thereby avoids the need to use force against him. But that Victor's justified in taking a risk of causing a harm, doesn't mean that if that harm looks set to eventuate, that he need not try to prevent it if he can. And we might also object that on my account, Jeff can make it impermissible for Victor to try to deter him just by being really determined to get the My Little Pony watch. And that's true, but I don't think it's an objection. It's just an upshot of having constraints on defensive harm that it can sometimes be impermissible to defend oneself against even culpable wrongdoers. Deterrent harm is no different in this respect to other forms of defense. If an action cannot avert a threat, then it cannot be a necessary means of averting a threat. That its ineffectiveness is the result of Jeff's resolve has no bearing on its being ineffective and therefore unjustified. Now, Larry Alexander gives the following example to try and support his claim that proportionality doesn't apply to actions that are intended to prevent culpable wrongdoing. We'll call this case burglary. So Jeff telephones Victor to explain that he's determined to steal his My Little Pony watch, but he has a heart condition that means that he's likely to die if finding it's too strenuous. So he asks Victor to please leave the watch in plain sight. Victor instead hides it in the closet, and then Julie returns home that evening to find Jeff dead from a heart attack on the kitchen floor. Turns out it wasn't too late for the trigger warning. Now, since Jeff is determined, there's no prospect of deterring him, and so the possibility of avoiding anyone's being harmed can't count in favor of hiding the watch. So is Victor's action disproportionate? Again, we can stipulate, possibly counterfactually, that the watch isn't so valuable that Victor would have been permitted to kill Jeff in order to protect him. And yet, Alexander says, few will believe that Victor has a duty to render a violation of his rights reasonably safe in the face of a violator's threat of, in effect, suicide. So again, if Victor may protect his watch despite foreseeing the lethal cost to Jeff, it must be because his protective action is not subject to a proportionality constraint. Now, this isn't really a deterrence case, at least not from Victor's perspective. So Victor doesn't tell Jeff that he's going to hide the watch in order to try and dissuade Jeff from breaking in. So nothing that Victor does increases the likelihood that neither he nor Jeff will suffer a harm. So if anything, the deterrence goes in the other direction. Jeff's trying to deter Victor from protecting his property. Or more accurately, Jeff's trying to coerce Victor into leaving the watch in plain sight. So deterrence usually aims to persuade its target not to perform a specific action, A, by making A more difficult or costlier than the alternatives. So when Victor lets his dogs into the yard in the create case, for example, he makes it riskier for Jeff to perform the particular action of climbing into the yard, but he doesn't attach costs to all of the other things that Jeff could do instead. Coercion, by contrast, usually aims to persuade its target to perform a specific action by making all of the alternatives too costly or difficult. And thus, coercion normally involves a much greater narrowing of its target's options and therefore a much greater restriction of their freedom. And this makes coercion much harder to justify than deterrence, other things being equal. Coercion is a much more comprehensive attempt and therefore more objectionable attempt to control the agent. And Jeff's call to Victor has this coercive character. So he's trying to make Victor do one thing in particular, leave out the watch for him, by attaching costs to anything else that Victor might do with his watch. Now, I suspect that it's the strength of our interest in resisting coercion that explains the intuitive permissibility of Victor's resisting Jeff's request, even though he foresees that Jeff will consequently bear a lethal cost. It's got nothing to do with what is proportionate for Victor to do in defense of his watch. Victor would be equally permitted to ignore Jeff's insistence that he'll kill himself unless Victor cooks him dinner or maybe paints his porch pink or various other demands that Jeff might unreasonably make. And so cases like burglary don't support Alexander's claim that defensive actions against culpable wrongdoers aren't subject to proportionality requirements. So what Victor may do to resist being coerced might matter for what it's proportionate for him to do in defense. So maybe Victor can do more to resist being forced to hand over his watch than he may do to prevent Jeff from taking it. We don't need to settle that issue here. What matters here is that this interest just isn't at stake in the cases that are meant to give rise to the exploitation puzzle. So Jeff isn't trying to coerce Victor into doing anything in either exploit or create. And so we can't infer from the fact that Victor may resist Jeff's coercion in the burglary case, despite foreseeing the resultant lethal harm to Jeff, that there are no proportionality constraints on Victor's actions in exploit, create, or defend. So there's probably loads of other things we can say about these cases, but this is one thought about how we might resolve this seeming puzzle that's been proposed. So what about the collateral puzzle? So the collateral puzzle centers on really familiar cases of deterrence, such as camera. So Kieran and Patrick have both got cars. Kieran installs a prominent security camera on his house in order to deter Jeff from stealing his car. And seeing the camera, Jeff steals Patrick's car instead of Kieran's. Now, Kieran's deterrent measure causes Patrick to suffer a harm that would otherwise have befallen Kieran. And it's a fairly standard claim about permissible defense that we can impose collateral harms on innocent people only when doing so prevents a significantly worse harm to ourselves, that is, only when it's the lesser evil. And clearly it's not the lesser evil if Jeff takes Patrick's car instead of Kieran's. And yet Kieran seems permitted to install a security camera. Hence, Kieran's action looks like proportionate deterrence, even though it would be disproportionate defense. And that suggests that either we can't understand deterrence as a form of defense, or that deterrence isn't subject to the same proportionality constraints as other types of defense. And both of these would undermine parity. So how might we explain the intuitive permissibility of installing the camera? The answer might partly depend on whether Jeff's determined to steal a car. So as we've just seen with respect to the exploitation puzzle, some deterrent measures decrease the risk of anybody suffering any harm. So if the camera has some prospect of wholly deterring Jeff, then Kieran might justify its use by weighing this deterrent potential, the chance that nobody's going to suffer a harm, against the risk that Patrick will be harmed if it fails. But if Jeff's determined to steal a car, then Kieran's deterrent measure merely changes the distribution of risk, making it much more likely that Jeff will steal from Patrick than from him. And this case is much more interesting, and it's the case on which I'll focus. So here, Kieran can't appeal to the fact that Jeff won't harm anyone. Rather, Kieran's relying on Jeff's harming Patrick. His camera can have a deterrent effect only insofar as Patrick's car presents an easier alternative target. So if Jeff is determined, then there's no point in putting up the camera unless Patrick's car is there to be stolen instead. So this means that we can't treat Kieran's use of the camera as akin to, say, deflecting a bullet away from himself to where it will hit somebody else. So we might be initially tempted to construe the case in this way. So we might think of Jeff as like a trolley that's heading towards Kieran, and that Kieran then diverts towards Patrick. But this analogy just fails to capture the way in which Kieran needs Patrick to be harmed if he's to avoid being harmed himself. And if it's meant to show that Kieran acts permissibly, then it would also be a really revisionary view of proportionate defense, suggesting that Kieran may harm Patrick to avoid just an equivalent harm to himself. Nor is using the camera an instance of ducking harm, as when Kieran moves out of an attacker's line of fire, knowing that then the incoming bullet's going to hit Patrick, who's standing behind him. Now here too, Kieran doesn't need Patrick to suffer the harm. Rather, any harm that befalls Patrick's just a genuine side effect of Kieran's self-protective action. By contrast, Kieran's avoiding harm in the camera case relies on Patrick's being harmed in a way that looks like harmfully using Patrick. And given the moral significance that we normally attach to harmful using, it seems as though, at least prima facie, installing the camera is harder to justify than either deflecting or ducking harm, insofar as those cases involve others suffering only collateral harms. Now, some of you might be wondering whether intervening agency explains why Kieran is permitted to put up his camera, thinking that this makes Jeff, rather than Kieran, responsible for any harm that Patrick suffers. And this would indeed distinguish putting up the camera from diverting a trolley towards Patrick. I'm just going to ask you to stick a pin in that thought for now while I sketch out what I think we ought to say instead. So I think that the limits of our duties to rescue explain why Kieran acts permissibly in camera. So on my account, the duty to rescue is a duty to treat oneself or one's resources as a means for the sake of others. And I understand treating oneself as a means in a fairly kind of straightforward or literal sense of just making yourself useful. Likewise, to treat someone else as a means is to make them useful. So our duties to rescue might require that we make ourselves useful by, for example, throwing somebody a weapon, pulling a drowning child out of a pond, smashing a fire alarm, calling an ambulance, fending off someone else's attacker, offering up our chocolate to a needy diabetic. They might require that we make someone else useful by, for example, compelling them to discharge their own duties of rescue, or by, say, using their unconscious body to prop open a fire escape. Non-consequentialists typically hold that it's especially difficult to justify harmfully using people. Persons are not merely pieces of equipment to be appropriated for the benefit of others. And the moral significance of using, of course, is widely believed to explain the intuitive difference between diverting a runaway trolley from where it will otherwise kill 5 to where it will collaterally kill 1, and pushing the 1 off the bridge so that his body blocks a trolley that would otherwise kill 5. So whereas harming a person as a foreseen side effect, of course, stands in need of justification, it's much easier to justify than harmfully using a person in order to enable others to benefit from her. The constraints on treating people as a means limit not only what we may force others to do for the sake of preventing harm, they also limit what we're required to do to ourselves to that same end. So on my account, the wrongness of pushing the 1 into the path of the trolley is just a direct upshot of the fact that the 1 has no duty to jump in front of the trolley. Our duties to rescue are cost-sensitive. The 1 need not make himself useful to the 5 when doing so will force him to incur such a high cost. And because he has no duty to save the 5, others may not force him to save the 5. There can be no lesser evil justification for harming a person as a means on this account. Either the amount of harm that can be prevented by using a person confers on her a duty to use herself for that end, in which case there's no right not to be used that's overridden on lesser evil considerations, or using her is just impermissible. Now, I think that this symmetry between when others may use us as a means and when we must use ourselves as a means holds in all cases of harmful using, except for those in which using is both unavoidable and reciprocal. So take a case we'll call Hungry Bear. So Kieran and Patrick are being chased by a bear. The bear will attack only the first person that it reaches. Kieran is a faster runner than Patrick, so if he outruns Patrick, then Kieran will escape the bear. Patrick's going to get eaten. Now, Kieran seems permitted to run faster than Patrick, But as in the camera case, Kieran needs Patrick to be harmed in order to avoid being harmed himself. There's no point in running unless Patrick's there to be attacked instead. So Hungry Bear therefore involves Kieran's making harmful use of Patrick, rather than, say, merely failing to save Patrick. If Kieran outruns Patrick, he doesn't require Patrick to treat himself as a means for Kieran's sake, but he nonetheless forces Patrick to become a means from which he benefits. However, this instance of harmful using is justified in light of the fact that Kieran and Patrick are symmetrically situated with respect to harmfully using each other. That is, Kieran can escape only if Patrick is bitten and vice versa. When harmful using is both unavoidable and reciprocal, using lacks its typical moral significance. Each can save the other only by making himself useful to the other. And given the cost of doing so, neither has a duty to make himself so useful. So just as the one has no duty to jump in front of the trolley to save the five, neither Kieran nor Patrick has a duty to let himself be attacked by the bear in order to save the other from that same fate. Since neither must let himself be used for the other's sake, each is therefore permitted to run, despite knowing that his escape relies on the others being harmed. So in other words, we first establish the lack of a duty to rescue, given the cost of doing so, and from that, we derive a permission to run instead. That the permission to run is derived from the lack of a duty to rescue explains why Kieran may run even if Patrick faces a substantially graver threat. So suppose that the bear will eat only one of Kieran's legs if it catches him, but it will eat both of Patrick's legs if it catches him. Because Kieran's duty to rescue doesn't require him to save Patrick from the loss of two legs at the cost of his own leg, Kieran may still run. Kieran's prohibited from running only if the cost that he faces is one that he would have a duty to incur in order to rescue Patrick. So, for example, suppose that the bear is going to lethally trample Patrick if it catches him, but it will only break Kieran's arm if it catches him. Assuming that Kieran is required to incur a broken arm for the sake of saving Patrick's life, his duty to rescue demands that he let himself be harmfully used at this cost for Patrick's sake. So Kieran may not outrun the bear in this case. Now, we might object that lacking a duty to save a person cannot justify harming them, and, as I've suggested, Kieran and Patrick harmfully use each other if they run. But the fact that Kieran lacks a duty to make himself useful to Patrick can permit harming Patrick if that's the only way to prevent Patrick from using him. So take a case like rope, for example. So Kieran's climbing partner, Patrick, has slipped on a mountainside. Patrick will survive until help arrives, provided that he continues to be suspended by a rope that's attached to Kieran. But Kieran will freeze to death unless he cuts the rope. Cutting the rope will send Patrick lethally hurtling into the abyss. Patrick has no right that Kieran remain in situ so that Patrick may use him as a means to avoid harm to himself. Because Kieran has no duty to let Patrick use him, he may cut the rope even if he thereby kills Patrick. This is also why, even if fetuses have the same rights as persons, a woman may lethally abort a fetus that can survive only by making use of her body. So it seems pretty clear that one harms the fetus in aborting it. But this is no bar to the abortion if the woman has no duty to make her body usefully available to the fetus. Our rights not to be harmed are usually cost insensitive because refraining from harming us doesn't usually require that other people make themselves useful to us. But when refraining from harming us does require others to make themselves useless, too gory. Yeah, don't blame him, don't blame him. When refraining from harming us does require other people to make themselves useful to us, then our right not to be harmed is cost sensitive, because whether we have such a right depends on whether they must make themselves useful to us, and that, in turn, depends on the cost to them of doing so. So if they lack a duty to save us, given the cost, then they may refrain from saving us, even if they'll thereby cause us to suffer a much graver cost. The limits on our duty to rescue also explain the permissibility of Kieran saving himself in duck. So Kieran may duck if, but only if, he need not make himself usefully available to Patrick. So Bors and Sorensen famously raised the problem that ducking in this case satisfies the definition of homicide in the US Model Penal Code, because if Kieran ducks, then Patrick's death is a foreseeable upshot of Kieran's voluntary action. And it's tempting to respond to these cases by focusing on whether Kieran can really be said to harm Patrick by getting out of the way. But as we've just seen, settling that question is just unnecessary for settling whether Kieran may move. What matters is whether Kieran has a duty to save Patrick at lethal cost. That is, whether Kieran has a duty to remain in place in order that his body block the bullet that will otherwise hit Patrick. If he has no such duty, and if his only option to avoid making himself so useful is to duck, then he may duck irrespective of whether this counts as harming Patrick. And of course, Kieran has no need to make use of Patrick in either the rope or the duck cases. So this lack of reciprocity or symmetry distinguishes these cases from the hungry bear case. Kieran may refrain from making himself useful to Patrick in rope and duck, even if he thereby causes Patrick to suffer a lethal cost. But Patrick may not impose a lethal cost on Kieran by forcing him to remain in place, because Kieran can avoid harm to himself without using Patrick at all. So returning to the camera case then, I suggest that demanding that either Kieran or Patrick, or both, refrain from putting up a camera is like demanding that they refrain from trying to run away from the bear. They're symmetrically situated with respect to harmfully using each other. And since neither is required to let himself be harmfully used to protect the other person's car at the cost of letting his own car be stolen, each is permitted to deter Jeff, even foreseeing that this can be effective only if the other is harmed. Now, to be clear, my argument here isn't that provided that one isn't making use of a person, then one's permitted to cause them harm in order to save oneself. The exception in the hungry bear case arises only because useful harming is reciprocal and unavoidable, and it limits the permitted harm to that which results from the permitted failure to save. So Kieran's not, for example, permitted to try and impede Patrick's escape by throwing stuff at him as he runs, right, or trying to trip him over. He can't justify this by saying that, look, it's just inevitable that one of us is going to be harmed because someone's going to get caught by the bear. So I think we can characterize the scope of Kieran's permission to harm Patrick in the following way. Kieran's permitted to increase the absolute difficulty of catching him by running faster than Patrick, and thereby increase the comparative difficulty of catching him. But he's not permitted to decrease the absolute difficulty of catching Patrick by tripping Patrick up or knocking him out, say, making him easier to catch, in order to alter the comparative difficulty of being caught in that way. The fact that Kieran's got no duty to make himself useful to Patrick doesn't permit him to make Patrick worse off in those ways. The thinking about hungry bear indicates why we shouldn't appeal to intervening agency to explain the permissibility of using the camera. Such accounts struggle in cases that are structurally identical to camera but lack intervening agency, such as camping. So Helen and Jeff are camping. Helen uses the bear repellent spray on her tent, but Jeff doesn't. The hungry bear is repelled by the spray and eats Jeff instead. Sad end to the talk, isn't it? Well, sad for me, I guess. On the plausible assumption that bears don't have morally significant agency, we can't invoke intervening agency to explain the permissibility of Helen's using the bear repellent. But it seems likely not only that Helen acts permissibly, but also that whatever explains the permissibility of Helen's deterrence in the camping case also explains the permissibility of Kieran's deterrence in camera. The My account gives us a unified explanation of these cases that intervening agency can't provide, and it does so without making contentious claims about how intervening agency bears on responsibility. And finally, of course, hungry bear's not a deterrence case. Neither is duck or rope. They're cases in which we're wondering what Kieran may do to save himself, foreseeing that saving himself will result in harm to Patrick. The fact that there's a unified explanation of the permissibility of saving oneself in hungry bear and duck and rope, and in deterrence cases such as camera and camping, helps to further support parity. All right, so the exploitation puzzle has been thought to show that if parity is true, then there can be no proportionality constraints on defensive harm against forewarned culpable wrongdoers. And I've argued that, to the contrary, the good that justifies threatening disproportionate harm to wrongdoers also arises in some non-deterrence cases and bears on proportionality across these cases. The collateral puzzle suggests that deterrent measures are not subject to the same constraints on proportionate collateral harm as other defensive measures. But I've argued that when deterrent measures alter the distribution of risk between prospective victims, their use can be justified if the victims are symmetrically situated with respect to unavoidably making harmful use of each other. The limits on our duties to rescue mean that when we lack duties to make ourselves useful to others, we may prevent them from making use of us, even if they thereby suffer greater harm than we avoid to ourselves. Hence, neither puzzle should cause us to reject parity. Thank you.
We now have a commentary from Kida.
Great. Yeah, I'm very grateful and honored to be commenting on Helen's paper. Thanks a lot. Thanks, Jeff. Helen's written such a wonderful paper. I think it's such a great tribute to Jeff and Jeff's work. Many of us here know that Jeff is famous for being reluctant to say no to people. So one time I said to Jeff, many of us think that you should say no to people more often. You then have more time to do your work and so on. And Jeff thought for a second, looked at me and said, you know, people do often say this to me, but what they really mean is that I should say no to other people, but not to them. I'm happy to confirm, however, that even that is not quite true. Recently, being in the final stage of my DPhil, I have to ask Jeff to write quite a few references letters for me. At some point, I started to feel quite bad because I asked so often. So I wrote to Jeff and I said, thanks, Jeff. Very sorry for adding to your workload. I will try to keep such application to a minimum. Thanks again. Jeff, not someone famous for replying to emails quickly, replied a mere 23 minutes later, and he said, and I quote, no, capitalized no, make as many applications as you can. Because I was busy with other things and also because I didn't quite know what to say in response, I didn't write back immediately. The next day, worrying, I suppose, that his point might not come through, he wrote to me again, and I quote, please don't worry, I'm always happy to support your applications. Jeff, I'm so grateful for being your student. I know that I'm but one of many beneficiaries of your career, but I have such a wonderful ability to make each of us feel very special and to inspire us to be better philosophers, but also better people. Thank you, Jeff. Yeah, thanks, Jeff. So my first comment is on Helen's solution to the exploitation puzzle. So have you that the value of deterrence explains how it can be proportionate to risk imposing and otherwise disproportionate harm. Deterrence, Helen says, increases the chance that nobody will suffer any harm. And so by releasing the dogs to bit off someone's leg would be a disproportionate defensive measure to protect one's watch. It may nevertheless be proportionate to place the watch amongst the dogs as a way to deter someone from stealing it. Crucially, on Helen's view, if the thief is determined to steal the watch and one knows this, one then cannot set out a deterrent measure that risks imposing otherwise disproportionate harm. For in that case, the measure will not bring about a distinctive moral good, the good that nobody will suffer any harm. And so it's not a deterrent measure after all. And this is this implication I want to question in this first comment. So consider the following case that I call thieves. So I live in a dangerous neighborhood with many people who want to steal my watch. I thus place my watch in my yard amongst the dogs, knowing that if someone tries to steal the watch, their leg will be bitten off by the dog, and I make this fact widely known. If the number of potential thieves is large enough, it can be statistically certain that someone will try to steal my watch and thus have their leg bitten off, given that there are many, many potential thieves. I therefore cannot point to the possibility that everyone will emerge unharmed to justify my placing the watch in this case. Intuitively, however, I think I might be permitted to place the watch. Might, I think emphasis on might, doing so might be proportionate. More generally, though, the important point is, I doubt that the proportionality threshold in this case is the same as in the case of an otherwise analogous defense case. So think, for example, of a case where I just someone is about to steal my watch, so then I release the dogs. The fact that that is disproportionate, so in the defense case, that is disproportionate, doesn't itself show that in the analogous thieves case I just gave is disproportionate, even though we stipulate that deterrence will fail, given that we stipulate that someone will try to steal the watch. And I think three factors may together explain this. The first is that if a thief's leg is beaten off, this may not be a case of my doing harm, for may alternatively conceive of it as a case of the thief doing harm to themselves. At most, I enable that harm to occur. And the second factor is that if someone is harmed, the harm occurs as a side effect of my act, rather than intentionally as a part of my plan. And the third factor is that any thief harm bear responsibility for the fact that they are harmed. And the more general point here is that these three factors typically distinguish deterrent cases from standard defense cases. Helen, I suspect, may be happy to grant the relevance of the first two factors having to do with the mode of agency with which harm occurs. She is, however, explicitly skeptical of the third factor, that having to do with responsibility. Her thought is that even in standard defense cases, those whom the victims may harm typically also bear responsibility for the fact that they are harmed. So think about Jeff's responsibility-based account, think about culpable attackers, conscientious drivers, they are all responsible for the fact that they are harmed if they are in fact harmed. I think, however, that there are different degrees of responsibility. So we can compare the following cases. The first case called high fence. Thief wants to steal my watch, and I warn thief that should he try to do this by climbing over the fence, I will release my dogs, which will harm him to degree A. The fence around my yard is high. So if someone is already in the yard, it's impossible to get out. It's easier to climb over the fence from the other side. Thief ignores my warning, climbing over the fence, so I release the dogs and the thief is harmed. That's high fence. Contrasted with low fence, same in high fence except that the fence is low. This means that even if someone is already in the yard trying to steal my watch, they can still easily climb out. So thief ignores my warning, climbing over the fence, and so I release the dogs. Importantly, even at this point, thieves can still easily leave and emerge unharmed by climbing out. He, however, persists to try to steal my watch, knowing that the dogs will attack him, and he's therefore harmed to degree B. I think that intuitively, the proportionality threshold, the maximum harm that it is permissible to risk imposing, is higher in low fence, the case in which the thief can still climb out after I act, releasing the dogs. And I think that it is thief's responsibility that explains this. Specifically, while thief is responsible for being harmed in both cases, if he is in fact harmed, he's more responsible in low fence. He can always choose, until the very last moment before he's in fact harmed, to abort his attempt at stealing my watch. Just a side note, note that there's no difference in the mode of agency between these cases. In both cases, if the thief is harmed, it will be a case of my enabling harm as a side effect. More generally, I think high fence mirrored standard defense cases with respect to responsibility, i.e. it is not the case that the attacker can always abort after the defensive agent acts, whereas low fence mirrored standard deterrent cases. The attacker can always abort in the deterrent cases. That's my first comment. My second comment is about the case burglary and Helen's discussion of deterrence and coercion. So burglary is the case where Jeff tells Victor that unless Victor, quote, leaves his watch in plain sight and thus allow Jeff to steal it, Jeff will steal it in a way that results in Jeff's death. Intuitively, Victor seems permitted to do this. And specifically, he seems permitted to, quote, hide the watch in his closet. But that, if true, will show that Victor's protective action is not subject to the same proportionality constraint as an otherwise analogous standard defense case. And Helen thinks that this is a case of coercion, not deterrence. For nothing that Victor does increases the likelihood that neither of them will suffer harm, given that Jeff is determined to steal the watch. Someone will be harmed one way or the other. Instead, Jeff is trying to coerce Victor into leaving the watch in plain sight. Specifically, deterrence aims to persuade its target not to perform a specific action by making the alternative more difficult or costly, whereas coercion try to persuade the target to perform a particular action, a specific action, by making the alternatives more difficult or costly. This matters because, as Helen says, coercion usually involves a much greater narrowing of its target's options and hence a much greater restriction of her freedom. And so it is the strength of our interest in resisting coercion that explain why Victor's act permissibly in this case, though he acts impermissibly in the case defend. So in the case in which there is just deterrent but not coercion. My concern about this, immediate concern about this case is that, as described, it's not a clear case of coercion. For leaving one's watch in plain sight may or may not refer to performing a specific action. It might just be the watch is there, I just need to do other things and just not take it, or it might mean I need to take it off of my closet and put it there. And more importantly, I think once we clear out the ambiguity, it's not clear that it's really the strength of our interest in resisting coercion, even though I think I agree that does matter, but I doubt that it is really that factor that is making a moral difference in the case burglary. So here are the final two cases. So compare the following two cases. The first case I called deliver. So Jonas and I had a dinner party yesterday at Jonas' house. I telephoned him today to say that I am determined to steal his watch, and that unless he delivers the watch to my house, because now it's at his house, I'm likely to die from anger given the existing heart condition. Jonas fails to deliver the watch, so I die. The second case is called retrieve. Jonas and I had a dinner party yesterday at my house, so I telephoned him today to explain that I am determined to steal his watch, which I can easily do, given that it's already at my house. If, however, he drives to my house to retrieve the watch, I'm likely to die from anger given the existing heart condition. Jonas drives to retrieve the watch, and I die. In deliver, I aim to persuade Jonas to perform a specific action, a specific course of action, delivering the watch. In retrieve, on the other hand, I aim to persuade him not to perform a specific course of action, driving to retrieve the watch. It is thus clear that, I think, in this comparison, that the strength of our interest in resisting coercion applies only to the case deliver and not to the case retrieve. Intuitively, however, I think Jonas acts permissibly in both cases. Good, thanks.
I'm going to just take a minute to... Just a minute, yeah, so I'll be quick. Kida was admirably concise. We know you're all keen to get to the bit where you get to tell me why I'm wrong. But I just want to, I thought it raised some things that's very helpful for me to clarify. So thanks very much, Kida. These are really terrific comments. So I think I should have more clearly distinguished probably between what we might call the substantive claims about what we should say about these cases and what we might call the formal claim of the paper that we should say the same thing about each of them. So if we take Kida's thieves case where lots of people want to steal my watch, Kida says, look, if there's enough of them, then it's just a statistical certainty that at some point someone's going to try and steal it. And if that's true, then it must also be true of the portcullis and the gun cases, right? So if Victor uses the portcullis and brandishes the gun often enough that at some point someone's losing a foot, right? And so two questions arise then. How does this bear on what Victor's permitted to do? And does it bear differently in portcullis compared to gun or exploit and create? And I'm really interested in that second question because it's this that parity denies. And I'm not sure that just pointing to the possibility of these statistical certainty cases gives us a reason to think that we must treat the cases differently. Of course, Kida also gives us some other reasons to think that we ought to treat them differently. The deterrence and the defense cases. In particular, he thinks that thieves more responsible in the deterrence case like low fence, and that therefore there's a higher proportionality threshold for Victor's actions in this case. So I guess one question here is, what does it mean to say that thief's more responsible in the low fence, right? So there's no difference between the cases, the high fence and the low fence, in terms of whether his movements are the results of his own agency, or how well informed he is, or how culpable he is. We might ask what he's responsible for, but then we'd still want to know how this affects what Kida's responsible for and the proportionality of what Kida does. So obviously, if we think moral responsibility isn't a pie, it's not zero sum, even if there's a sense in which thief is more responsible in the low fence case for what he does, it's not going to follow that Kida's any less responsible for what he does. And the proportionality of what Kida does seems like proportionality normally is, just to be a question of the good that you can secure and how that compares to the risks that or the harm that you're imposing. And it's just not clear how changes in thief's responsibility affect that calculation. Now, of course, one difference between these cases is that in the low fence case, there's lots more opportunities for thief to be deterred than in the high thief case, right? He can jump back over the fence at any time. And so the fact that there's a greater opportunity for deterrence in low fence could explain your intuition that there's a difference in proportionality between the two cases, but this would just be the explanation given by my account, that the deterrent value is bigger in the low fence case. On the burglary case, so what I say in the paper is that it's harder to justify a typical case of coercion compared to a typical case of deterrence. I think making this point is probably a bit unhelpful, because this doesn't mean that we have weaker permissions to resist unjustified deterrence compared to unjustified coercion. So most people think, for example, that useful killing is harder to justify than collateral killing. But this doesn't mean that you've got different defensive permissions against unjustified collateral killings and unjustified useful killings. So I think what I can do to resist being unjustifiably killed is the same whether you're unjustifiably killing me usefully or unjustifiably killing me collaterally. So I just don't take a stand in the paper on that issue. So your intuition that it's permissible in both the retrieve and the deliver cases to not drop off the watch and to take the watch is compatible with what I say, because the threat in each case is unjustified. And so, I mean, my point in the burglary case, I think, it's not that you're permitted to do more to resist coercion than deterrence. So if we had a variation of the burglary case where Jeff were unjustifiably trying to deter victim, then it could be that Victor can proceed just as he does in the original case. My point is that whatever the relevant interest is that explains what Victor's permitted to do despite the lethal cost to Jeff, just isn't at stake in the exploit and the create cases, because Jeff's not trying to get Victor to do anything or refrain from doing anything in those cases. And so we can't get support for Alexander's claim that there are no proportionality constraints on Victor's action and exploit and create from thinking about the burglary cases. But I think the way I've put it is unhelpful. So thank you. You're very helpful. I'm very unhelpful.
All right. As every chair has vainly said, please keep your questions concise, and speakers, please keep your answers concise. We'll start with Jeff.
Thanks. I just am having a question here about deterrence that parallels some questions that people were raising about nuclear deterrence in the past, but I want to apply this idea to the individual case. Suppose I want to deliver a mild insult to Victor. But I know how hot-tempered he is, and he's very likely to just punch me in the face, which would be a disproportionate and unjustifiable response to my insulting him. So what I do is I strap on this doomsday device so that if anybody punches me, will annihilate that person instantaneously. And so I go to Victor and I forewarn him. So I've got this doomsday device on. And I then insult him. And because of this uncontrollable impulse, he just punches me and is killed. A couple of questions here. One is, was it proportionate and permissible for me to do this, to use this deterrent device, this doomsday device. And is it just a matter of the probabilities? You know, how likely is it to, or is there something else relevant here? And secondly, when Victor has been annihilated by the machine, given that he was forewarned, who's responsible for his death? Now, I want to stress, I think responsibility and permissibility are quite distinct. It may well be that, for example, that Victor is responsible, but it was impermissible for me to do it. The answers don't have to be the same.
Thanks so much. Yeah, so, I mean, I've been kind of thinking about this stuff in the background of the sort of doomsday sort of problems. And so I guess part of me is wondering whether it is just sort of probabilities. And so I guess the question is, if we had a sort of a non-deterrent parallel. And so you said Victor has an uncontrollable urge to punch you in the face. But which, you know, yeah, and given we know that's a sort of, you know, certain fact. But so it's, I guess my question is, like, this is sort of, that's the point, right? Do we think these things are different? If the probabilities and the harms are the same, and we've got one device which is a deterrent device and one which isn't, it's just like the portcullis case, whether we would think that there are different permissions in these cases. So I get that the sort of the intuition of thinking, you know, it seems like clearly disproportionate, bad for you to do this, right? And bad because it's a disproportionate response. But my question is just whether there are parallel cases that are non-deterrence cases in which we should have the same reaction, right? So that's kind of the question that I'm interested in. So then it might just be probabilities. And the question then, you know, would we have some reason for thinking that the probabilities had to be different between a deterrence case and other non-deterrence defensive cases? And I guess I don't see at the moment why we might think that they'd have to be different.
This wasn't meant as a challenge to parity. It was just a thought about issues you had raised about deterrence.
Okay, all right, okay, yeah. So yeah, I mean, I think these are the kinds of, this is certainly the kinds of issues I'm thinking about. And on the responsibility question, yeah, so I mean, and then this goes back to what I said to Kida, I guess. It's like, we just want to know more about what it means to say something like that. Did you think that you were responsible when you'd done this, or that Victor was responsible when you strapped on the machine? You want to say that you're responsible for Victor punching you, or Victor is responsible, you're both responsible?
A lot of people want to say one or the other, particularly in thinking recently about this repeated claim that Hamas uses as civilians as shields and that kind of thing. And what Walzer and a lot of other people say is, well, if they're using them as shields, they're responsible, and therefore it's permissible to do whatever you want because Hamas is, you know. So I was trying to connect I mean, I think the responsibility is shared, but one question is there somebody who has primary responsibility, or, you know, the degrees of responsibility? So it's just that kind of question.
Yeah, but then we also want to know, like, and then how does settling that question about responsibility then bear on what is proportionate for you to do? Right, and that's, yeah, so then I'm kind of, yeah, so then that's why I'm wondering whether, even though a lot of the attention does focus on this sort of, this acting last question, right, and I think a lot of people have this thought, well, surely it must matter who acts last, that sort of that you're doing it to yourself in some sense. But a bit like I suppose, I'm a bit unclear about how, I think this kind of collapses a bit into the acting last thought, that if you do it last, then you're the one responsible, and it's just a bit unclear how that's meant to affect Victor's responsibility for what he does. And if we're interested in whether Victor's defense is proportionate, then we're asking what Victor's responsible for. And that just doesn't really seem to sort of stand or fall with who acts last, I don't think.
Thanks. So I really like this idea about reducing probability and that explaining the difference between these Alexander cases. I just wanted to ask about a potential other difference between the exploitation case and the defense case. So in the defense case, the question we're asking is, do you gain a permission, right? It's ordinarily, if we think about the kind of baseline about what your ordinary rights, you're ordinarily not permitted to punch someone or harm them in the way that you might be permitted. So the question is, can you gain the permission? And in the exploitation case, the question is, are you losing a permission? Normally, you can put your property where you like. So it would be ordinarily permissible for Vic Victor to throw his watch over his own fence into his own garden with his own dogs. And so the question is, does he lose that permission given the situation? And so, given that asymmetry between the kind of starting points, if you like, or the moral baseline against which we're comparing the defense factors, that might impact on the proportionality calculation as well as, this isn't to say anything against what you've said, it's just kind of an additional difference.
Thanks, yeah. So I guess that's nice, that's good to think about. But the thought of these cases is supposed to be that we say that you're doing it just in order to, right? So he's just throwing the watch in order to stop Jeff from taking it. So we kind of carve off the thought that there could be loads of reasons why Victor lets his dogs into the yard, right? But we're just trying to say, like, he's just doing it for this reason. Now, did he previously have a permission to, and then that looks a bit question-begging, right? Because it's sort of, that's what we're trying to work out, is did he already have a permission to let his dogs into the yard in order to protect his watch?
So alternative point then, that might influence the intuitions that Alexander relies upon, that what you're doing is something you ordinarily are permitted to do. Right, so the idea that there's no proportionality in the exploitation case probably relies on the idea that you're doing something with your own property that in every other circumstance you'd be permitted to do.
Yeah, maybe, yeah, thanks. Yeah, that could be right.
Thanks. So this was partly covered by Jeff's question about responsibility, but in drawing a line between the exploit, create, and defend case, you talk about the who was it that gave the acting last as why we draw a line between create and defend? It was.
So I think Nino actually gives that defense, and then David Arm says we shouldn't do that because it's just unclear how the responsibility.
Yeah, I mean, so when I think about acting last, I mean, one way to rehabilitate it is in a way that was you were kind of suggesting, or maybe Jeff was kind of suggesting, was in terms of intervening agency. That it's not who acts last that matters in and of itself, but rather the fact that the harm that was the upshot of what Victor did is mediated by Jeff's agency in these cases, and that might be relevant to Victor's responsibility. Now, in anticipating this, you suggested that responsibility is one thing and proportionality is another. But I suspect that some people are going to say that when intervening agency does have relevance, it functions precisely by delimiting the share of the harms that sort of go in your column of the proportionality calculation. And is that something that, this is not a challenge, this is a question, is that something you want to deny?
I mean, I guess I'm generally kind of skeptical about the idea that intervening agency supplants responsibility or liability, and such that the mere fact that somebody's the more proximate cause of the harm sort of exempts those further back in the causal chain from responsibility, right? So this is sort of my standard civilian liability story, right? So the mere fact that the combatants are the ones on the pointy end doing the killing doesn't undermine civilian responsibility in virtue of the contributions that they make. And so I don't want to, so I'm kind of, I guess, a little bit sort of not naturally drawn to the intervening agency view. Of course, it gets more complicated when it's sort of the person who's intervening is sort of intervening and then they're the ones who harm, but it's not just going to follow from the fact that there's intervening agency that the other person
dialectically speaking, this is again not a challenge, just a question. Dialectically speaking, for those who do think, contrary to what you suggested, that intervening agency is relevant in the way that I think, then do they just have an easy off-ramp to the dilemma?
Well, it depends on the...
Predicated on a false
view. Yeah, I mean, in that sense, I guess if easy doesn't need to be true.
So I'm skeptical of your appeal to reciprocity to justify in Hungry Bear. I'm skeptical of your appeal to reciprocity to justify outrunning the other in Hungry Bear. So suppose that the other person is asleep and you happen to be awake and you realize that if you just leave the campsite, then you'll be all right because the bear will eat the sleeping person. If the sleeping person weren't there, he would eat you, but he'll eat the sleeping person. I think it's permissible to leave the campsite. Now, you might then try to say, well, there's some sense of reciprocity if you were in different positions and maybe he would do the same. But suppose he wouldn't do the same. Maybe he's a total mistaken pacifist, or he has, mistaken views about what you're allowed to do in self-defense, or maybe he's just too old to, run you or something. You say if you were younger, if you weren't a pacifist, you would do the same. But at this point, I think reciprocity breaks down. So
reciprocity is not about whether you would do the same. Right? It's not a kind of normative reciprocity. It's more about the causal setup, that even the sleeping guy, the only way the sleeping guy survives is if he makes use of me, in the sense that he needs me to be eaten if he's to survive. The fact he's asleep doesn't make any difference to that, right? So we're still symmetrically situated in the fact that whoever the bear gets first is going to get eaten, and so the sleeping person needs me to be eaten if he's to be left alone, and I need him to be eaten if I'm to be left alone. And that he's having a doze, I think, is not going to matter.
Okay, reciprocity might be misleading then, and to explain that the fact that there's a sense in which each of you is causally useful to the other, but if reciprocity applies even when you're completely asleep, etc., then I think there's some other
So the way I
symmetries
explain reciprocity in the paper is just that I say that the fact they need to make harmful use of each other is reciprocal. That's all I say. I don't say anything about each of them would do this or anything like that. It's simply a fact about the causal structure of the case, that they're symmetrically situated.
Yeah, symmetry might be better. Yeah.
Maybe symmetry is, yeah.
Thanks, guys, for a great talk. So look, this might just be a term of art, and people could use terms however they want, but I find at least one of your terms puzzling and perhaps unhelpful, and this is the idea that Kieran is harmfully using Patrick if he runs from the bear. I just don't see it that way. I don't even think that he's using him. I do think he's taking advantage of the fact that there's a slow person there. But taking advantage and using it, let alone harmfully using, seems to be very different. I do think that here's one way of thinking. Suppose Patrick was just there alone. The bear would eat Patrick, right? Now Kieran's there as well. Kieran runs away. Now Patrick's there alone again. The bear eats Patrick. I just don't see him using him there. It seems, let alone harmfully using him. I do understand that if Kieran was there and the bear was coming and he called Patrick and said, Patrick, why don't you come play with me in the woods? That would be harmfully using him. Or if he had a rope and he threw it around him and he tied him up, that would be harmfully using him. But Patrick was going to die one way or the other, whether or not Kieran was there, as the story's told. He's not responsible for him being there, as the story's told. I don't think he's harmfully using him. He's allowed to run away, and sadly, Patrick's going to die as he would, even if he weren't there. So I'm just puzzled. I mean, you could say he's harmfully using him because of this structure, and he will die if he runs away, et cetera, but I don't find that a very helpful way of thinking about the case.
Then I guess maybe we just disagree. So I do think that it's enough that there's no point in running unless Patrick's there to be eaten instead. Means that Kieran's relying on Patrick's being harmed in a way that's enough like using a person for it to make sense to think of it in these terms. And also I think that the fact that we can, capture the plausible intuitions in this case by thinking about the limits of the duty to rescue, which I do think are basically explicated in terms of the limits of our duties to make ourselves useful to people. I think that it's a good reason to think that actually this is something that falls under what we should think of as the scope of what it is to use a person. So I perhaps do have a slightly more expansive notion of what it is to use someone. So for example, I think if you deliberately leave somebody on the trolley tracks so that the trolley hits them, even if they're there already, you don't put them there, you just fail to rescue them. I think that counts as using them, making use of them for the sake of the five. And I think likewise in the bear case, the fact that there's no point in running unless Patrick's going to be eaten instead means that you are benefiting from using Patrick in a way that we should.
So just a one-sentence follow-up. Will you at least acknowledge that there seems to be a difference between the two ways of harmfully using him? One, you take advantage of the fact that he's there. The other, you throw a rope around him or you call him. Those seem to be very different to me.
Because so it might be helpful to talk about those cases. there may be differences in the sense that Kieran, that in that case, Patrick's not currently endangered, and so to avoid being harmed in that case, Patrick doesn't need to make any use of Kieran, and so Kieran acts impermissibly when he does that. So there is a difference, in my view, between those cases. It's wrong for Kieran to induce Patrick to endanger himself. He's fine in the treehouse. Right? Let's pretend bears can't climb. He's fine in the treehouse, right? And then Kieran sort of entices him down to the ground. That's wrong because Patrick doesn't need to make any use of Kieran at all in that case, right? So we can explain, on my view, why that's impermissible and different. But it is different from a case in which they're being chased by the bear and Patrick does need Kieran to be eaten if he's to escape, and vice versa.
Thank you so much, Helen and Kida. I have two questions. One is about the difference between cases of deterrence in individual defense or individual deterrence and cases of collective deterrence. I think there is a difference between the two because I don't see how you have a right. Say if you raise the stakes, I don't see how you have a right to deter your neighbor from attacking you. You need to go to the authorities. You cannot harbor a weapon, unless not if you don't live in New Orleans. You should go to the authorities. Yeah. Whereas this is different in the case of war. Now, which brings me to another issue which you might want to consider. There are differences in the way that we talk about deterrence. Of course, as Larry said, it is a term of art, but there is a difference between deterring through a threat. You signal to the adversary the consequences that might happen, and there is a difference if you are attacked by an adversary and say that in order to achieve a defensive benefit, you need to, say, destroy one battalion, but you decide instead to destroy two. You don't need to destroy the second one, but you do it in order to deter the adversary. So there are differences between deterring through signaling and deterring through inflicting harm, and I think that there are also differences between deterrence in the individual case and deterrence in the case, say, of war as a goal of war.
Thanks, Elad. So when you say you don't have a right to deter your neighbours, so do you think Kieran may not put up a security camera? No one can have a security camera because only authorities have the right to deter.
I'm not sure that installing a camera is deterrence in the sense of that you inflict harm.
Oh, okay. So you just mean in cases of harmful deterrent measures where I harm as a means of deterring you. You think that's not permissible amongst individuals and can only be authorized by the state?
I think that the question of whether deterrence is a permissible goal comes into effect when there is harm which is inflicted, yeah.
I mean, I guess in the spirit of parity, I can't see why there'd be anything special about deterrence distinct from other forms of defense with respect to like what the state can do and what individuals can do. So normally I can't, punch Jeff in the face, but if he's attacking me, then I can punch him in the face. And I think I could also do things, kick him in the shin a bit to deter him from a more forceful attack, even though I'm not a state authority. So just in the way in which ordinarily we should let the authorities use force, but when that's not available and it's broken down and the police are not around and so I have to defend myself, it's permissible for me to use force, even though ordinarily I should call the police or whatever, rely on the police to do that. I could also forcefully, harmfully deter Jeff when there's no authority around to help me in the circumstances. So I don't think there is going to be a difference there in terms of needing a sort of legitimate authority in order to sanction deterrent measures in a way that, say, would be different from ordinary defense where we can do it between ourselves if necessary. And then I think your second question is more about the issues of kind of harming, where that's then the harmful deterrent is a sort of means to some further deterrent, like more general deterrent strategy, it sounded like, if I had understood your question correctly. So I was not in the paper trying to think about general deterrence in that sense, where I harm Jeff as a means of deterring some third party. I was just trying to think about the cases where it's a side effect of the deterrent measure that I'm using, that they might be harmed if they will be harmed if the deterrent measure against them fails, but not this kind of instrumental harming where the goal is to deter some other person, which is a kind of the more traditional sort of punitive that we get in the punishment literature about whether I can harm you as a means of deterring others. I wasn't really sort of trying to address those questions.
So this is going to be a follow-up on Patrick. I just want to make sure whether you're committed to something like the following. So Victor has his watch and his dogs, and he lives in a neighborhood where all potential watch stealers are not at all determined.
Not for deterring.
Not at all determined. Then determined Jeff moves into the neighborhood. Suddenly Victor acquires a duty to get rid of the dogs, and furthermore, Victor owes this duty to Jeff?
So kind of possibly, right? So this is what I was writing this paper. I was thinking this is kind of raises a bunch of questions about, like, so I think that the thing, like most people are going to think it's a bit nuts to say that Victor needs to go and save Jeff once he's being mauled, but like they might think that seems really strange that you've set up this deterrent measure, and then I say, look, you've got to go and rescue him. Now it didn't work, but it seems true to me because it's not clear to me why he wouldn't have a duty of rescue.
I'm okay with the rescue.
Yeah,
I'm not okay with
so it might be that if you just know that somebody's going to, I mean, I guess sorry, John wants me to be quick. My short answer is, I don't think it would be stupid if that were true. I'm open to the thought that it might be true, and I will think about whether it's true, and then. I guess I'll find out at Jeff's 80th party or something. But no, I think it's a good question. I think it's an interesting question.
So conveniently, excuse me, my question is kind of a follow-up to that one. I was thinking about it, and it's not meant to be a knockdown argument, it's just a thought in terms of moral hazard, right? So oops, there goes my computer. If proportionality is grounded in the risk, then there's an incentive for people like Jeff to learn to be undeterrable, right? And then here's the extra public hazard. If your scheme were publicly acknowledged, okay, so we have now adopted the Helen Frowe account of these sorts of deterrent measures, then that's going to send a message to the public. Everybody learn to be undeterrable.
Right, so that's why I at the beginning said I'm not going to talk about the general shoring up of the efficacy of issuing deterrent threats, right? So that's that kind of question of like, what would happen if we had this general policy and everyone found out? I just wanted to focus on, without those broader issues about undermining general deterrent or deterrence in general and stuff like that, just to think about this sort of very particular issue about, you had to let Victor have a go. Just think about the specific question of the exploitation puzzle and set aside those broader questions. So it's not, that just makes it more complicated. Deterrence is, what I'm learning is deterrence is really complicated, and there are going to be those broader questions like that, but I also think we can independently ask these questions about whether these cases give us reason to think that there aren't these proportionality constraints in light of these puzzles, and I think that we don't have to reject parity on those grounds.
So on the responsibility stuff, it might just be worth distinguishing different reasons why responsibility is thought to matter in the literature. So opportunity to avoid looks the same in these things. If you're like a Scanlon person, then you should treat these cases the same. If you think that what matters is whether the harm is attributable to the person, then you've got to start thinking about intervening agency, and that might determine the extent to which it's attributable to the person, and then it might make a difference. And so we need to know a little bit more about why responsibility matters, I think, to resolve the dispute that we had about responsibility earlier. And on the one other difference I thought there was between the deterrent case and the mere defensive case, like the Portcullis case, is that in the Portcullis case, the harm's just a side effect, whereas in the deterrence case, you've got a conditional intention that if the person, of course it's a side effect in the sense that you don't want the condition to be fulfilled, but once the condition's fulfilled, you intend the harm to occur when the person jumps over the fence, because that's how you're using the fact that the person will jump over in order to deter them. That's what you need. And then you might think, look, conditional intentions matter.
So I don't think that that's true. I don't think that you have to have a conditional intention that they be harmed. And that's why, for example, I think you've got to go and rescue them, right? Which would be weird if what you also were permitted to intend to come about was that they in fact be harmed. So I don't think, so it might be true that you also do perhaps hope that they get eaten or whatever, but that would just be, the mere fact that you could have that intention doesn't mean that you rely on it in a way that's going to make it
in the non kind of like the illusory version of the case, I intend that if Jeff jumps over my fence, he'll be eaten by the dogs, because by putting the dogs there, that's the way in which I get him to act. And so I have that intention at least.
I don't think you do. I think you intend that he not jump over the fence. I think that's what you're trying to
also
do. Is stop him from jumping over the fence. And then I think it can be a source of enormous regret to you that he gets harmed by the dogs. And that would be weird if you were intending that. Sorry, yeah.
It remains for us to thank both Helen and Kida.
Oh, they should have.